Okay, let's cover the upper extremity in this video. Okay, so this video what we're going to do is look at the upper extremity component of the appendicular skeleton. So let's first look at the pectoral girdle. This is the shoulder girdle on this one. All the images that you see here are from the Visible Body app that you can get and look at as well. The one that we're looking at specifically here is the Anatomy and Physiology application. You can also see these images on the Atlas application as well. So these are very good to check out. So the pectoral or shoulder girdle is going to consist of two bones, actually four, two on each side, and that's going to be the scapula posteriorly, okay, and then this is going to be the clavicle anteriorly on this one, okay. So for the first thing that we're going to be looking at, we're going to go through the individual parts of the scapula. So let me exit out of this image here, go to the various landmarks on here. Now again, you have access to these images to get more detail on it. You can also click on this little booklet icon here that will give you additional information as well. So what we're going to do, we'll go through all the various components of this. Make sure you check your lab manuals to determine which specific components you are going to be held responsible for. All right. So let's look at the first part here, and all the things that we're going to be looking at is going to be highlighted into a light blue portion. Okay, so let me turn that on and off. You can see how it's turning to light blue. That's the structure that I will be discussing. Okay, and this one that we're looking at specifically, it's kind of my favorite one. This is the glenoid cavity, or also known as the glenoid fossa. Let's see if anybody can figure that one out, why that's my favorite. Okay, so this is going to be on the lateral side. This is the medial side of the scapula. And the glenoid cavity articulates with the humerus, which is your arm, okay? And we'll talk more specifically, it's going to be the humeral head on this that articulates with this one, okay? So that's known as the glenoid cavity. So this is the anterior view, this is lateral, this is the medial side of the scapula, this is the posterior view, medial side of the scapula, lateral side, and you can always tell the difference between anterior and posterior views of the scapula is the scapula posteriorly has this big structure coming off the back, and as you can see on the front or the anterior side, it's nice and smooth. So posteriorly, you're going to have this component. And since we're talking about this component, this is known as the spine of the scapula. Now, the spine of the scapula separates this region from this region. This is your supraspinatus fossa. And as you may deduct from this, once we get into the muscular system, this is where the supraspinatus muscle is going to be located. This region of the scapula below the spine is your infraspinatus fossa. Okay, so this is the spine of the scapula. Going out laterally, we have this structure here. This is the acromion process, or the acromion. This is the distal end, or the end of the spine. So this is the end of the spine of the scapula. And this is going to be used for attachments to the deltoid muscles, the trapezius muscle in that area, okay? And again, you're going to have the supraspinatus muscle up here, infraspinatus muscle down here. We have the coracoid process. The two structures that you would likely get mixed up is going to be the acromion and the coracoid process here. Coracoid is just superior to the glenoid fossa or glenoid cavity. Okay. And the coracoid process, it's an attachment site for the pectoralis minor muscle, biceps brachii, coracobrachialis, in this region. Okay. We talked about the infraspinatus fossa, so you can see the blue. Okay, that's the infraspinatus fossa. Supraspinatus fossa is in this region. And the one that we have not talked about is the subscapular fossa. So this is what this is called. This is the anterior surface of that one. So that is the scapula. Next thing, let's look at the clavicle. Let's look at the specific landmarks of this one. Two things. We're going to have the acromial end of the clavicle, and this is the portion that's going to articulate with the acromion process of the scapula. So you have the acromion of the scapula, and that articulates with the acromial end of the clavicle. Okay, and where those two meet forms the AC joint, acromioclavicular joint. You will hear, especially if you're in the healthcare field, that there's always, where people have shoulder issues or shoulder complaints, a common diagnosis is associated with the AC joint, or AC stands for acromioclavicular joint. The sternal end is going to be on this one, and then that's going to articulate with the manubrium of the sternum. And if you don't recall where the manubrium is, go back into the axial skeleton videos and check that one out. So that's going to be the clavicle. The superior surface is a little bit smoother than the inferior, although this image, being with all this colors, you can't see the texture of it. The inferior surface is a little bit rougher than the superior surface on this one. And the acromial end, you're going to have this portion of it. It's the coronoid tubercle. And that helps you to identify that this is going to be the acromial end of this one. Okay, so that's the clavicle on this one. The next thing, let's look at the upper limb, and when we're going to be dealing with the humerus, let's just name the primary bones right now. The humerus, that's part of the arm. Then we're going to have part of the forearm, which is going to be your radius, and then your ulna. Okay, the radius is on the, now again, go back into what the anatomical position is. And the anatomical position is upright, arms down to the side, palms facing forward. Okay, and the radius is on the side of the thumb. So let's bring this one up. Let's magnify this a little bit more. So here's highlighted as the radius is in blue. This is the thumb. Okay, so the radius is on the side of the thumb. And in the anatomical position, this is going to be the lateral bone. The ulna is going to be on the medial side. Okay, so we'll go through those specifics. Now let's look at the specific landmarks of the humerus. The key things that we want, and again, follow along on models with this. Okay, so when you are in lab, you need to be locating each and every one of these structures that I'm pointing out. If you are not doing that, I promise you the lab test is going to be much more difficult than you will want it to be. Okay, so let's look at the humeral head, or the head of the humerus. You can see it this way. Okay, so we're looking at, this is the anterior view, posterior view. Anterior view. When you're trying to identify the various structures, you're going to have to be able to look at or figure out what is your anterior and posterior sides, which is your medial and lateral sides. The head of the humerus, or the humeral head, is always going to be on the medial side. Okay, so whichever the position is going to be, we know this. If it's positioned this way, this is the medial side. If it's positioned this way, this is the medial side. Okay. A couple other things that we're going to be looking at. We've got a couple larger structures right up in here. That's going to be more on the anterior viewpoint. And then if you turn it around, we're looking at a hole, not a hole, a depression back here. This is a fairly deep depression compared to the one, whoa, let me go back here, compared to this one, okay. Posteriorly, this is a deeper depression than the anterior one. And a couple other structures, let me organize this. And this little bump on the side here is a little bit more pronounced than the other side. So this is the medial side, okay. This is a shallow depression, which we'll name it in a second. Posteriorly, it's a deeper depression. So those are a couple ways of orienting yourself to this, okay? So this is the humeral head. This little spot in between, that's the neck. It's called the neck, so head and neck. And then a couple of other things that we're going to look at is this piece here. This is called the greater tubercle, okay? This is going to be similar to what we're going to name in the femur, but in this case, it's a tubercle that will change in the femur. So the greater tubercle, these are two large bumps here, okay? Now the greater tubercle, this one is the larger of the two, and it provides an attachment site for the supraspinatus muscle, infraspinatus, and teres minor muscles, okay? So we have three different muscles attached to this, and therefore it's going to be a little bit larger and a little bit beefier in size. The next one in is going to be more anterior medial than the greater, and this is the lesser tubercle. And the lesser tubercle is the attachment site for the subscapularis muscle, okay? There's going to be a groove in between, so it's this dark groove here, so let me highlight it. This is the intertubercular groove, okay? So we got a greater tubercle, lesser tubercle, and then we have your intertubercular groove, and this is where the tendon of the long heads of the bicep brachii goes, okay? So muscles attached to bone via tendons, okay? So the tendon for the long head of the biceps brachii goes through this passageway in between the two tubercles. We're going to have a radial groove. This is just on the posterior surface. Deltoid tuberosity. So as you go down to the diaphysis, if you don't remember what the diaphysis is, go back and review that information. A roughened surface here is the deltoid tuberosity. That is where the deltoid muscle will attach to. Let's moving further distally. Let's look at the trochanter. Let me move this thing up, okay? And this part highlighted in blue. So the trochlea, we're going to have two articulating surfaces. We're going to have this one and then this one. This portion is called the trochlea, and it is going to articulate with the olecranon of the ulna, okay? And once we talk about the ulna, I'll point that one out. Okay, so this is called the trochlea, and this is going to be, well, let's just skip that one. Capitulum is this other one. Well, let me magnify this back in. Okay, so if this is the trochlea, this is the capitulum. Okay, this is on the lateral side. The trochlea is on the medial side. The capitulum is what's going to articulate with the head of the radius, or the radial head, okay? The coronoid fossa, if you recall one of the things that I was talking about, the difference between an anterior and a posterior view, this depression is somewhat shallow when you compare it to this one, okay? The shallow depression is on the anterior side, and that's called the coronoid fossa, okay? So that's the coronoid fossa. Posteriorly, we have the olecranon. I don't like how it zooms out. Okay, posteriorly, that deeper depression is called the olecranon fossa, and the olecranon fossa receives the olecranon of the ulna. Two common areas that you will definitely need to be aware of are your medial and lateral epicondyles, okay? Radial head, this is the medial side. This larger bump, that's the medial side. That bump is called the medial epicondyle, okay? Medial epicondyle, that is going to be the attachment site for the pronator teres muscles. Definitely know it's the attachment site for the common tendon of the extensor muscles of your wrist. Okay, so that's, back that up. Medial epicondyle, attachment for the pronator teres, and common tendon for the flexor muscles, not the extensor, flexor muscles. Don't get that mistaken on this one. Lateral epicondyle, you can guess it. If you can point it out, that should be this little spot here. That's the lateral epicondyle. Let me raise this up so you can see it a little bit better. Okay. And the difference between the medial and lateral, you can see the lateral is a much smaller one than the medial. And the lateral condyle is an attachment site for this supinator muscle, and it's also the attachment site for the common, it's a common tendon for the extensor muscles of your wrist and hand. So the muscles, if you can feel, put your hand on the back of your forearm and extend your wrist back. You can feel these muscles pull. Those muscles come back and they go to that portion, okay? Flexor muscles are going to be on the medial side. Let's look at another one here. That was the humor. So let's look at the radius now, okay? Now the radius, we're going to have different parts. So let's look at the radial head. So this is the proximal side. This is the distal side, okay? So this is a rounded part. So let's just turn it on end. You can see it's nice and round, okay? The distal end is more of a triangular widened area, okay? So proximal is the rounded side. This is the radial head. That's the radial neck, or the neck of the radius. The radial head is going to articulate with the capitulum of the humerus. This is going to be the tubercle, and this is the attachment site for the biceps brachii. Okay, so once we get into the muscles, biceps brachii, that's going to insert into the tubercle. Styloid process, that's going to be the distal portion. That's that little point on this one. And that's going to be the attachment site for the carpi ulnaris muscle. And then the ulnar notch, which is that little piece down here. We're going to have the ulna following here, and this is articulating with part of the ulna. Let's go to the next bone, and let's look at the ulna. Okay, so here's the ulna, that what we're looking at. Let me get it all in the picture here. And let's look at a few of these different processes that we're dealing with. First, let's look at the coronoid process. That's this little piece in front. So we first, again, you have to figure out what's anterior and posterior. This big hook looking thing, that's going to be on the posterior side, and then that is the anterior surface. So this is going to be the anterior surface. And the coronoid process, it's attachment for the brachialis muscle, flexor digitorum, superficialis, profundus muscles, okay? The olecranon, that's a key one because that's a big obvious feature that we're going to be looking at. Okay, so this is going to be part of the olecranon, and this is going to be received in the olecranon fossa of the humerus. So go back, look at what the olecranon fossa is, and when you do elbow extension, so we're looking at this elbow extension, the olecranon is then going into the olecranon fossa. Okay. We have a radial notch, so the radial head is going to articulate with this. So remember that rounded part of the radial head, it articulates here. Trochlear notch, this is what articulates with the trochlea of the humerus. Styloid process, this is at the distal end. Okay, that's that little pointy process that we're looking at. Styloid process is the attachment site for extensor carpi ulnaris. Okay. And then the head. Now remember, the radius, the head was at the very top. Here, the head is at the very distal end of this one. Okay. So now let's look at the carpal bones. Okay. I'm not a big fan of how these are listed. So I'm going to go back and forth between a couple different pictures, okay? There are 8 carpal bones divided into 2 different rows. There's 4 in the proximal row, and there's 4 in the distal row, okay? So the carpal bones that we're looking at are going to be all these bones in here. Okay, see, these are all the different carpal bones that we want. Let's first name the proximal row, and what we're going to name them, we're going to start them on the lateral side, working medially. So we're going to start lateral, working medial, then we'll go to the distal row, start lateral, working medial. You can Google various mnemonics for learning the carpal bones. There's some good ones out there. Find something that works for you. But let's start looking at the proximal row first. We're going to start this one. That's known as the scaphoid. Okay, scaphoid bone. This is on the thumb side. Okay, so this is the radius. This is the scaphoid. This is going to be going down to your thumb. Okay, next one through is going to be the lunate. So we're going to here. Let's go through this way. We can see the bones a little bit differently here. So there's actually 2 bones here. This way it just looks like there's 1 and there's 2 here. So scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, or triquetral. Okay, so that's triquetrum, and pisiform. Pisiform is actually a small sesamoid bone. Okay. Now let's go back through this way. You can see these a little bit easier posteriorly. Then we're going to be dealing with the trapezium, which is this one. And this is going to be the trapezoid. Capitate. Capitate is the one kind of in the center of your wrist, and that's the largest carpal bone. The scaphoid bone is your largest of your proximal row. Capitate is the largest carpal bone, and it's in the center of your wrist. And far out, this is going to be the hamate. And the interesting thing with the hamate, you can see it's got this little structure here. That's called the hook, or hook of the hamate. So you can easily identify those bones. This one, so we've got 3 pretty obvious bones. Scaphoid is a large one, capitate, and it's a little bit curved. Capitate in the center. Hamate, and it's got this little hook on it. And then you also have pisiform, which is a really small rounded one, which is a sesamoid bone. Okay, you will need to know identifying the carpal bones. You need to know their names. You need to know the order of them. Any lab quiz will have a model of a hand and the wrist bones. I just won't have a small little bone laying on a table. You'll see all 8 of them with a sticker on one of them, and you'll have to identify which one that is. So spend some time looking at that one. Okay. So now let's go into the hand itself, and then let's look at where are we at here? Let's look at the hand. Here we go. So the first, we have the carpal bones up at top. Next thing, let's look at the metacarpals. Okay, you have 5 metacarpals. This is going to be going out to the thumb. Let me zoom out a little bit. This is going to be the thumb, index finger, middle, ring, little finger. So there's 5 metacarpals, and there's 5 of them each hand, obviously. Then The bones distal to that, those are called phalanges. And there's going to be 14 phalanges in each hand. Okay? There's going to be 5 in the proximal row. So the proximal row is going to be those. Then you have 4 in the middle phalange. As you notice, the thumb does not have a middle phalange. Middle phalanges are only in the index, middle, ring, and little finger. And then the distal phalange, here's where the thumb comes back into it. So we have 5 there. So you have 5 metacarpals, 14 phalanges. So you have 5 in the proximal row, 4 in the middle row, and then 5 in your distal row. So those are the skeleton, that's the skeletal structures of the upper extremity. Again, spend time in lab. Make sure you identify this on a model because lab quizzes will not be based on pictures. Okay? Next thing, let's do the lower extremity. Thanks.